Hello, welcome to Geography 2050, the Future of the World Ocean. And this specific panel is Coastal Risk and Resilience. My name is Michael Steinberg. I'm a professor of geography at the University of Alabama. My research deals with coastal communities and fisheries in Central America and the Caribbean. So I'm especially looking forward to the speakers we have today that deal with everything from local scale mangrove analysis and deforestation to global measurements and informatics of environmental change. Our first speaker today is Mr. Steve Canty from the Smithsonian Institute.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the American Geographical Society for the invitation. I'm going to give a brief overview of some important global trends in mangroves. And for those of you that don't know, mangroves are a diverse group of plants that are found along the tropical and subtropical coastlines and provide critical ecosystem services such as protection from storms and hurricanes, and are part of important climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. And they also provide nurseries to commercially important fish species, which provide livelihoods and food security to coastal communities. But despite their importance, we've lost between 50 to 85% of mangroves globally. And if we look at data from 2000 to 2012, we can see that total deforestation losses have been focused in Southeast Asia. But is this the whole picture? And I don't think it is, because when we look at proportional losses, we can actually see that we've had significant losses throughout the entire geographic range of mangroves. And these data give more of a holistic view of what's really gone on during that time. And also what these maps don't really show is other problems that also face mangroves, such as habitat fragmentation and also the decline and degradation of these ecosystems. But despite this rather gloomy picture, there is cause for optimism. Over the last decade, globally, mangroves over the last decade, global mangrove deforestation has significantly declined. And in some areas, mangrove cover has actually increased, and this is due to restoration. The driver behind these changes has been their role in climate change adaptation and mitigation. But what is the real potential for restoring mangroves across the globe? So what we can see here from this map is that there is potential, but in some places it's less than 10 to 20 hectares. So understanding the nuances of this, we actually need to drill down from this global perspective to local and regional pieces. And if we go into the Mesoamerican Reef region where I work, a transboundary resource shared by Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras, an area that lost 30% of its mangrove cover between 1990 and 2010, we can see that there is huge potential. But is this the real picture? Because in a few places, we can see that there's large-scale availability for restoration, but in many places, it's as low as 10 hectares. And have the threats actually disappeared? So to support some of these efforts, we were part of a team that co-led the development of the regional strategy for mangrove management, conservation, restoration, and monitoring. The aim of this strategy is to provide a regional context for local and national actions. And we're supporting these efforts through the creation of habitat maps. And we're actually creating the first regional mangrove cover map at a 10-meter resolution. And as you can see, here's a couple of my colleagues, including Mike Steinberg, out in the field ground truthing for this project. We're also conducting large and fine-scale genetic analyses to assess the management scales required for mangroves. Is it just a local population or is it a regional population? When with the fine-scale analysis piece, we're actually ensuring that genetic diversity is maintained within restored populations. And then finally, we're assessing blue carbon. This is the carbon held within the mangrove plant itself, but mainly the sediments. And we're assessing the potential for blue carbon as a sustainable financing mechanism to support some of these actions. And it also goes into the nationally determined contributions, which are part of the Paris Agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So overall, what we're really seeing is, yes, there have been some large losses of mangroves regionally and globally, but the tide is turning and there are reasons to be optimistic about the future of mangroves. Thank you.
A little bit broad questions. Given that your first few slides were from the global perspective, can you talk about, are there particular countries or regions that have embraced restoration more than others, and what might be the drivers in those decisions?
Thanks, Mike. So there's restoration going on everywhere, which is great. And actually one of the big initiatives going on at the moment is the Global Mangrove Alliance. And this is bringing big NGOs, academics and governments all together. And the Smithsonian's actually a partner in this. And this is trying to sort of bring up the awareness of mangroves and also drive this change. And the aim is to increase mangrove cover by 20%. And within Southeast Asia, that's where some of the largest efforts are occurring. It's also where we've seen some of the major losses. But the good news is that restoration is taking place everywhere, and it's a major driver for us to find out how to improve best practices to make sure that ecosystem services come back, and we're not just bringing back a forest that doesn't do what it used to do or can't, and also can't adapt to the future, knowing that climate change is a big threat to some of these systems.
Great, thank you. One other question. Having worked in mangrove ecosystems before, I know it's not as simple as just sticking seedlings in the ground. Can you talk a little bit about the dynamics of mangrove ecology that lend themselves to successful restoration versus just sort of piecemeal, again, just sticking seedlings in the tidal zone?
So one of the big things that we're pushing, and we've got some great colleagues up in Mexico in UNAM and Cinvestav who have been pushing this more natural process for regeneration. And so a big piece of this is assessing the system before even planting. Planting is actually the last thing that you should do, because with any good plant, if you don't want it there, it's a weed. But the thing is that they will grow where conditions are good. So if we can look at the state of the hydrology, so the movement of salt water, but also fresh water into the system, and has that changed? How do we bring that back? Has the sediment changed? Do we need to just turn the sediments over to make them more a better climate for the seedlings to grow in? Most of the time, if we do this, the propagules will flush in from healthy mangroves around, and all of a sudden you'll see regeneration happening. And what you often see in places that have been cut down for development but haven't been developed, you'll see all of the seedlings coming in because the conditions are good. So restoration in the form of planting, not that it's not needed sometimes, it shouldn't be the primary method. What we should be doing is looking at how to facilitate this secondary, more natural succession. And with that, we actually get more representative ecosystems to what they used to be. What we find is when you start planting, there's changes in genetics. We plant them more sort of like a forestry system, like we're creating a plantation, which doesn't represent what the system does. So if we can, natural regeneration is the best. And if really needed, planting comes in as sort of option B.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question. Can you talk about the role of local communities in some of the restoration efforts? Not necessarily just the physical labor, but are local communities incorporated in some of the planning and even sort of the environmental memory of what's been there, and so planning for the future?
That's a great question. So for a lot of the work that we do, it's all driven by local community requests, because they need something but aren't quite sure. So, that's the role of the Smithsonian and other institutions. It's how can we help them to get to the goal that they want, not for us to dictate what they should be doing and you have to conserve and restore. So yes, local communities are key and should be the ones leading it. And it's our role to facilitate that best action. And yes, there's some great efforts going on throughout Central America and other places where it's all community-led, and it's I think it's also our responsibility as well, not to just involve them in that initial process, but also to find out how they benefit from the return of those mangroves. Are we creating the benefits that we promise? So are they protecting from hurricanes? Are they providing these fisheries? And I think by showing that these benefits do come and at what times, we allow to set expectations a little bit better, both for ourselves, but also for the communities, because there's no way that a newly planted or newly restored area is going to protect against a hurricane in the first few years. It can take, a good 10 to 20 years for a mangrove to reach a reasonable height where you would expect that. But it could give a fish nursery. They could start sequestering carbon, maybe not in huge amounts, but they could start water quality or water filtration. So there's many things that they can give. And it's really understanding that piece of that monitoring and evaluation for your success.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm sure some of the other panels will have questions at the end. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Alfredo Giron-Nava. Dr. Alfredo Giron-Nava is an Andre Hoffman Fellow at Stanford University's Center for Ocean Solutions and the World Economic Forum Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Dr. Giron-Nava's work focuses on the use of technology to support sustainable fisheries management and the reduction of illegal, unregulated, and unreported catch at a global scale. His previous experience includes projects for sustainable fisheries management in the US, Mexico, Canada, Palau, Solomon Islands, the European Union, and a series of studies at a global scale. Welcome, Alfredo.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that introduction. The title of my talk is Fish and Humans, Tales Only Maps Can Tell. And let me start with a question. What have maps taught us about global fisheries? Just as an example, we have known for a very long time that fisheries have reached their maximum, at least since the 90s. And ever since they have been decreasing slowly and steadily. But it wasn't until we looked at a map for the first time, for example, here in the 1950s, where the red areas indicate where we used to fish most intensively. It wasn't until we looked at this map and we compared it to the map in 2005 that we understood that maybe we are running out of space for new places to fish. So that trend finally starts making sense. Another example is that we know that international markets put a lot of pressure on ecosystems worldwide. But it wasn't really until we put it in a map, in this case, how sea cucumber fisheries expanded from Japan from the 50s to the 90s, that we understood that radial expansion, not only of the market, but of the collapse of different stocks worldwide, here in red, the overexploited ones. And so when I think about this, I look at the new technologies, I look at the new capabilities that we have, and I think, wow, this is the first time where we can really look at all of this in a map and understand our total fishing effort, our global footprint, almost in real time. And this is only possible because of the spatial components. So because of that, I always try to think about, like, what part of the story are we missing? What is it that we could understand a little bit better if we looked at it geographically? And so let me just give you a little bit of my background. I am from Mexico. I had the luck to work in the Sea of Cortez, the beautiful Gulf of California. Although it has one disadvantage, the underwater landscapes and those amazing sunsets are really difficult to work with and to focus. Well, that was intended to be a joke. But the thing that I really want to say is that this is a place that is not only beautiful, but where fisheries are deeply, deeply ingrained into society. They have a very high cultural value. And it's not only that they support tons of families, but also that they are interesting because they are not always easy. It's not an easy activity. Fishers have to live far away from home, sometimes fish depleted stocks, and not make a lot of money, apparently. And so one of the things that we have known for a while in the Gulf of California is that both the mean trophic level and the maximum size of fish in the region have been decreasing for a while, at least 5 decades now. And what this means is we are just running out of big fish. And so at the same time, the number of nets, boats, and fishers has been increasing almost in an exponential way. And not only that, but the Mexican government has been actively pursuing this as a goal to expand our fisheries capacity, with the idea that by having more fishers in the water and assuming that the ocean can keep providing, we can employ more people. And even though that might be true, there needs to be a deeper analysis on like, how will this really play? And so following that line of thought of like, everything looks better in a map, during my first years of research, I tried to do a map of fisheries in the Gulf of California. And so basically, we took aerial surveys. We went with airplanes taking photos of every boat we found. And then we took satellite imagery and had research assistants count the boats in each pixel. And then we came up with this map of the density of fishing boats throughout the whole region. And also, unsurprisingly, what we found is that the places with the settlements, the big cities, Mazatlan, La Paz, Guaymas, are the ones that have the most fishing. And then the question to me becomes, okay, what does this mean back to the community? What does it mean to those fishers that already have depleted stocks? What does it mean for them and their families? And so taking it a little further, here you can see different regions in the Gulf of California started from low population to high population, and then the average income of fishers per month. And what you see there is the poverty line. The thing that I want to highlight is that the higher the population, the more prone they are to be below poverty levels. And so this has sparked me a couple of questions about like, okay, that expansion of fisheries and that promotion of more permits, it doesn't seem like it's well supported. But well, while we keep working with the Mexican government, I saw this invaluable opportunity to become an ethical geo fellow last year. They were looking for projects. The American Geographical Society was looking for projects that wanted to use geographical information to say something about the cultural and ethical implications of data. And just gave it a try, pitch a project, trying to sell the idea of creating a similar exercise to what I did in the Gulf of California, and trying to map the status of fishing communities around the world, particularly related to their income and how it compares to national poverty levels. And this is the result. What we found is that places in orange are places where on average fishers are below their national poverty line. You can see Mexico is one of them. But one of the things that I want to draw your eyes to is this region of the world, where arguably, many of us will agree that they are some of the most dependent on the oceans for their income. And so this is just a project that is still going on. It still has a lot of potential to keep developing. And where I want to close with is that now I have really started transitioning from this question about what have maps taught us about global fisheries to how can we use this information to inform sustainable development that considers both the environment and people. Thank you.
We've got time for a couple of questions. And one thing I wanted to start with was referring to your slide that showed the decline of fish size. And that seems to be a common theme we see throughout the world, everything from cod, swordfish on down, or at least among the large species, large-bodied species. In Mexico and in the Gulf of California and the Sea of Cortez, is that driven by national consumption, or is it driven by feeding the tourist market, because some of those cities are tourist destination? What's happening there? Where's the demand coming from that's driving that?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great and complex to solve question. I mean, especially in the Gulf of California and also in the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of it comes to the US. I am also currently in the US. And those big fish, those highly valued fillets, we want them here. We pay more for them in these markets. More recently, there are new markets, particularly in Asia. And well, they came a little bit late to the game because the really, really big fish and sharks are already gone, but they are still like putting a lot of pressure in some of those other vulnerable stocks. And I am talking now about species like devil rays, like steel sharks, like the last big groupers and sea basses that we have in the region. So not a lot for national consumption, though. There's some, but not a lot.
Right, thank you. And then another question related to the slide showing the density of fishing boats. That's a great project. It's a fascinating use of remote sensing and aerial photography. Is the local government or national government even interested in that sort of data so that they might be able to better manage the spatial distribution or the permit system, or is it more just a free-for-all sort of classic tragedy of the commons?
Yeah, that's another. We have tried to work with them, and we have tried to say like, okay, here are the places where it could require some attention. It's difficult, not only because of the licensing permits, the licensed fishers, but also because of all of those that are not licensed. Our study didn't separate between those two. So even though national policies are updated every 4 or 5 years regarding the effort in the water and like how to assign permits, there's a legacy to all of this, and it's really difficult to enforce. So the work now is starting to become more a little bit of a grassroots kind of work in which fishing communities get educated and say like, okay, what can we do as a community to really have strategies and biologists in our communities and so on that can help us inform sustainable practices. Still, places like La Paz, Mazatlan, Guaymas, where they are just like cities, these strategies don't work. So we are still struggling a lot on how do we do this? Is there a partnership with the government that we can push a bit more or something? Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And we'll return to a couple of these issues at the end among all the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Dr. Bernice Rosenzweig. She's an earth scientist with a special interest in urban hydrology and climate change resilience. Her qualifications include a Bachelor of Science from Rutgers University, PhD from Princeton University, and postdoctoral research associate at the Environmental Science Initiative, City University of New York. She's an author of articles on green stormwater infrastructure, adaptation to extreme rain, pluvial flooding, ecosystem-based nitrogen regulation, and resilience indicators. Dr. Rosenzweig previously taught at Queens College and the City College of New York. She joined the environmental science faculty at Sarah Lawrence College in 2020. Bernice, welcome.
Hi, so thank you so much. My name is Bernice Rosenzweig, and I'm new faculty at Sarah Lawrence College. My research focuses on urban coastal environments, and particularly densely urban environments like New York City. So I'm going to talk about the Jamaica Bay Sewershed of New York City. And yes, we usually use the term sewershed and not watershed, because in these really dense urban environments, the hydrology is so dominated by the built environment. And I'm going to talk very quickly about Jamaica Bay's history and how that impacts its current resilience practice. So just for some background, the Jamaica Bay Sewershed is located in the southeast of New York City. Most of the drainage area is actually located within the boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens in New York City, and some of the key features of the sewershed include JFK Airport. Jamaica Bay suffered catastrophic damage during Superstorm Sandy in 2012. And so this is a photo of the aftermath of Sandy in the Howard Beach neighborhood. And so flooding is obviously a major challenge for planners in the area. But as we begin to think about the resilience of Jamaica Bay and the future of Jamaica Bay, it's important to keep in mind that it's not just flooding from extreme events that we have to focus on, but also there's really a dual challenge of both planning for flooding and managing flooding, as well as protecting Jamaica Bay's natural ecosystems. Although Jamaica Bay is a densely urban environment, it's also part of the Gateway National Recreation Area, and it's an important site as part of the Atlantic Flyway for migratory birds. So there are many types of flooding that Jamaica Bay stakeholders have to think about. There's storm surge flooding from extreme events like Sandy. There's high tide flooding that occurs regularly and obviously will continue to occur more frequently with sea level rise. There's flooding from cloudbursts. There's also flooding from groundwater because most of Jamaica Bay was located in historic wetlands, as I'm going to discuss in a moment, and the water tables in the area are very high. And for any given flooding event, there's usually some combination of multiple mechanisms that have to be considered. All of these issues are going to be exacerbated with climate change. So climate change will exacerbate both extreme rain as well as sea levels, as well as have impacts on the water table, since the sea level serves as a boundary for groundwater. And all of these things, all of these issues and mechanisms have to be considered in our planning. So this is just an overview of what Jamaica Bay looked like pre-development. So this is a historic topographic map that was surveyed by the U.S. Geological Survey in 1899. And this was right before most of Jamaica Bay's development really began in earnest in the 20th century. So what I think is really key to point out is the extent of historic wetlands, which is the blue hatch marked area shown in this map. You can also see the current shoreline, which is the pink line that's shown on this map. And the overwhelming majority of Jamaica Bay's pre-development wetlands were filled with a variety of different landfill materials rapidly for urban development through the first part of the 20th century. So today you can see how drastically different the Jamaica Bay Sewershed looks. And so all of those natural wetlands have been filled. The bay also has serious water quality issues as a result of the 4 wastewater treatment plants that serve the sewershed. And you can see where they're located on this map. And so the remaining wetlands play an important role in nitrogen regulation. So using denitrification to reduce the water column nitrogen. But because the notings of nitrogen in Jamaica Bay are so high, they're only able to do so much. At the same time, high nitrogen loading can impact the stability of Jamaica Bay's remaining wetlands, which is a big concern in the region. So this is some mapping of the hydro period of Jamaica Bay's salt marshes. And so the remaining salt marshes are primarily the areas that receive regular inundation throughout the year. In this case, we're showing data from the year 2013. And the data that are shown here come from water level measurements from the Inwood gauge, which is shown at as the green dot on the right of the figure. And so Jamaica Bay's remaining salt marshes are more and more inundated each day. As sea level rises, the hydro period is going to increase, as well as their exposure to the nitrogen that affects their stability. And so the salt marsh area that receives more frequent inundation also receives higher nitrogen loading, and have actually been the marsh areas that have the highest rates of degradation. And so this is just some mapping of Jamaica Bay's nitrate, in this case, concentrations. And you can see they're extremely high, particularly in the remaining tidal creeks that are downstream of outfalls of the wastewater treatment plants, as well as the combined sewers. And so nitrogen management is a priority issue in the watershed that has to be considered alongside flood planning. So the legacy of Jamaica Bay's historic landfilling still impacts a lot of the issues that I've discussed so far. So this is just a map, once again, showing the USGS's historic topographic map in 1899, as well as the mapped area of inundation during Superstorm Sandy. And you can see that there's a really strong relationship based on the present day elevation. Areas that were historically landfilled are the lower elevation areas and more prone to flooding from storm surge. These are also the areas that have high water tables. And so as we think about how we're going to manage flooding in future years, we have to be mindful of the fact that these are areas with high water tables. So we have to be mindful of the fact that these are areas with high water tables, so that presents challenges for using infiltration-based solutions. But they're also the areas that are most prone to flooding. So in conclusion, there's a lot to think about in terms of what we can learn from past transformations to support climate change resilience plan, and how we can identify synergistic opportunities for flood resilience and ecosystem conservation. So my research focuses on mapping historic transformations, their social, ecological, and technological drivers, as well as identifying opportunities for flood resilience that also support conservation of ecosystem services. And so thanks, I'm happy to answer more questions and talk more about my work.
So Bernice, thank you so much. That was fascinating. My first question is related to some of the storm surge damage. I'm curious, in other parts of the world, other parts of the United States, it's been shown that low-income communities are often disproportionately affected by storm events, and I'm thinking of the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans after Katrina. Can you talk about your study area, and is that a relationship there, or is it sort of, was it an equal opportunity destructive event?
Well, are you talking specifically about Superstorm Sandy, or are you talking about flooding in general? Flooding
in general, but also Superstorm Sandy, if you want to refer to that event.
So for Superstorm Sandy, the flooding affected a range of different incomes, or communities that have a range of different incomes. There are quite a lot of very wealthy coastal communities in the Jamaica Bay watershed that are taking advantage of the amenities of being located along the waterfront. There are also quite a lot of communities that have been there for generations and are predominantly middle-income, working-class people that experienced severe coastal flooding during Sandy. But it's important to remember that especially in an urban environment, our mapping doesn't really reflect the flooding that's actually occurring. So when we look at maps, for example, the Federal Emergency Management Agency's 100-year floodplain maps, those are really coarsely resolved. In many cases, they're outdated, and they don't really represent the flooding that's happening, both because of coastal flooding as well as because of extreme rain in an urban environment. And so what we found is that in many cases, when you have a storm like Sandy, we have pretty good metrics of who is experiencing the flooding because of insurance claims. But when you have these smaller scale, frequently occurring events, which can be both coastal as well as driven by rain and by combinations of both, they often occur outside of the mapped floodplain, and they often happen to people that don't carry flood insurance. So those costs are borne by the residents because they can't file an insurance claim. And at the same time, there's no record that it's happening because we primarily use insurance claims to understand who's experiencing flooding. So we're doing a lot of work on alternative ways to understand who's experiencing the impacts of flooding, not just from these extreme events like Sandy, but repeatedly during smaller scale chronic events.
Great, thank you. And then one last quick question. I know this falls outside your area a little bit, but I want to sort of tie it in with some of the other speakers as well. Could you talk a little bit about, with all this runoff and the wastewater treatment plants, what are the ecological conditions? You mentioned, sea level rise and high nitrogen, et cetera, but can you talk a little bit about just the local ecological conditions in these salt marshes? How resilient are they?
So that's a great question, because we don't know what the threshold is for how much the wetlands can take. Wetland loss has been accelerating over the past couple of decades, and Ellen Hardig, who works for a National Park Service in New York City, she works for the New York City Parks Department, has done amazing work in terms of mapping the rate of salt marsh loss in Jamaica Bay. There's also a really significant initiative to restore salt marshes in the bay, but the wetlands are impacted both by sea level rise as well as by nitrogen loading, and they're both connected because as sea level rises, the wetlands will be further exposed to nitrogen, which there are high concentrations present in the water column. And we just don't know what the tipping point will be for the wetlands, when they can no longer continue to regulate nitrogen, but will be degraded to the point that we can't continue to restore them, and they'll be completely lost from the system. So that's a really active area of research, and we just don't know what that threshold is, or whether potentially we've passed it already.
Excellent, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dr. Dawn Wright is Chief Scientist of the Environmental Systems Research Institute, also known as Esri, a world-leading geographic information system, or GIS, software and data science company. And if you are a geographer, you know all about and use Esri all the time. She was appointed to this post in October 2011 after 17 years as a professor of geography and oceanography at Oregon State University. Dr. Wright also maintains research interests in spatial data science, seafloor mapping, coastal ocean informatics, and environmental education. She has authored or co-authored more than 150 articles and 10 books on marine geographic information systems, hydrothermal activity, and tectonics of mid-ocean ridges, and coastal ocean informatics. Welcome, Dr. Wright.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. I am very thrilled to be on this panel and at this meeting, and to be discussing these really critical coastal issues. What I'd like to do in my presentation is talk a little bit about what interactive maps can bring to this conversation about coastal issues. As we've seen from my colleagues with the beautiful maps that they've shown, maps indeed can really help us to see the reality of the dangers to mangroves, the impacts of our global fishing efforts, the transformations within densely urban coastal ecosystems, all to plan, to restore, to survive, and to adapt. And what we're really talking about, as we've just heard from Bernice, is we're talking about resilience, resilience to flooding, resilience to coastal heat, and as I'll get into a little bit, resilience to sea level rise. So there are all of these amazing maps and apps now that are available on the web, on our phones and tablets, and they help us to actually make friends with regard to these critical conversations, to keep that conversation going, to create a coastal and climate economy, and to take action. So what I'd like to really focus on is action maps. So let's start at a global scale. So this is a big initiative that's now underway. It's called the Living Atlas Indicators of the Planet. And as you can see, it's like a report card for the entire Earth. And if you go to this site, which is livingatlas.arcgis.com/indicators, these indicators fill up your entire browser window. Now, Esri has partnered with Microsoft and National Geographic and the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network to compile 18 pressing topics affecting our planet with real-time or near real-time data to match. So what we're looking at here is really like a single point to understand the day-to-day and year-to-year changes that are occurring on Earth for all of these various parameters, including many that are ocean and coastal related. I'm just going to go quickly to cyclones here, because one of the things that we are really taking advantage of now is real-time live feeds as to what is happening on the planet. So we're looking at current Epsilon, Hurricane Epsilon, which is moving through the North Atlantic. Thankfully, it is not going to make landfall on the US East Coast. And if we look at this in another view, we can actually zoom in to, let's say, going offshore of New York, given that the Geography 2050 meeting would have occurred in New York City. We can actually get an idea, a closer look in terms of the path of Hurricane Epsilon, and also what the the forecasted position of Epsilon will be as it moves throughout the North Atlantic. So these types of near real-time or real-time are really important for us, especially for our public safety, especially now since we are still in hurricane season. It is predicted to last through the end of November. Another application, and this touches on a little bit as to what Alfredo was talking about, it's very important for us to understand heat events on the coast and future heat events in terms of the vulnerability of different populations to heat. So this is a somewhat complex web application that was put together by NOAA, and it also includes NOAA's climate modeling as combined with the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. And what we're looking at is the vulnerability, in this case, at this scale of the entire nation, but the red polygons, this is a county level map of the United States, and the red polygons are the most vulnerable counties in terms of vulnerability to heat. And in terms of the variables of socioeconomic status, household composition and density and disability, minority status and language, housing and transportation. And over here, there is a summary for Perry County, Alabama, which is deemed as one of the most vulnerable counties. And it's giving you the breakdown in terms of how much of its perfect vulnerability score is divided by all of these various factors. Now, this web app does a lot of crunching, number crunching along the way, so I'm not going to have time to show you everything, but if you move up to 2050, since this is the Geography 2050 meeting, it calculates future populations, future vulnerabilities. In fact, it just calculated for us that in 2050, the projected maximum number of total days for Perry County, Alabama, with temperatures over 95 degrees is going to be 64 days. So that's a lot of heat. Let's move on to an even more higher resolution scale, a local scale, and look at a sea level rise app. So this is a specialized app that shows you what sea level rise will be like in the future. And there are many apps like this that are out there. But this one focuses on not only how much the ocean will encroach upon the land, but what critical infrastructure will be impacted. So here it's giving you symbols on this map, and I'm choosing St. Petersburg, Florida this time because I was recently in a webinar with the mayor of St. Petersburg, Florida, and he talked about what an amazing place this is, especially in terms of this being a peninsula on a peninsula. And so the symbols on the map focus on various kinds of critical infrastructure. It could be where local law enforcement offices are, medical facilities, fire stations, oil and gas facilities, railroad stations, transit stations, airports. And if we just move this slider up to, let's say, about 3 feet of sea level rise, which would be a calculation for about a decade from now, we're seeing here the extent of sea level rise, but also that certain electrical facilities are going to be in danger of flooding. If we go forward to 2050, and the sea level rise there will be anywhere from 7 to 9 feet estimated for this area, we can see that much more is going to be affected in terms of medical facilities, fire stations, electrical facilities, and of course the St. Petersburg airport. So this particular app is focused on the major coastal cities of the United States and allows us to plug and play, so to speak, with what will happen in the future. Another thing that is really important, and all of us as geographers are involved in this, and you've already heard from my colleagues, stories. You've heard very effective stories about these amazing issues. And a medium called the story map is very, very important for this. This is a story map that was put together by NOAA with Old Dominion University. And it talks about coastal flooding in terms of what it is. It goes through various parts of the world where you can see examples of coastal flooding, and there's small interactive maps that are included with those statements throughout the world. what the data are telling us in terms of, this is a global map in terms of where sea level rise is increasing, especially in coastal areas, and what's going on in terms of US coastal regions. This is looking at Norfolk, Virginia, so you can see what the expected flooding will be in terms of sea level rise for Norfolk, Virginia in the year 2040. It goes forward and it talks about what this will look like not only in 2040, but also in 2060, 2080, and beyond. And then it takes you through some other resources, ending with action in terms of what can we do, what other resources are available. And I think this type of storytelling is extremely valuable. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I'm going to stop presenting now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dawn. That was fascinating. And my first reaction and question is, we can predict these things, and now thanks to Esri, we can see these things, even sea level rise, et cetera. What's the reaction to local governments, or from local governments, or in corporations? Are people starting to plan accordingly, or is it more management by crisis as we've sort of seen in the past?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And one of the things that we're seeing, especially given that, I don't want to get too political here, but given that our country as a whole has been removed from the Paris Climate Accord, we have been hearing stories of how state and local governments have moved on with climate resilience on their own. And the power of maps that we know is that maps should be and are now in the hands of all kinds of people, including those in local and state governments. So we're finding that these governments are taking our tools and building their own applications, building their own maps. And this is really important, especially from what we've heard from Bernice and from Alfredo and from Steve, in terms of the local communities need to be at the forefront of this and need to be able to use these tools in order to do their own planning. Now, I could go on and on about this, but another angle to this is the awakening among corporations in terms of corporate social responsibility, and in terms of the private sector doing their part as well, and showing how they are contributing to solving the problem instead of being part of the problem, especially those of us who have facilities or offices that are in coastal regions.
Thank you very much. And then related to that, you know, some of the, I've read in various media outlets that some of the South Pacific Islands in particular have been, you know, aggressive in terms of climate change leadership. And do you find that in terms of their embrace of this sort of technology, or do you have interactions with them? And I mean, have they reached out, you know, Palau, the Maldives, you know, you name it, in terms of their interest as well, not just US cities or corporations, but these international actors as well?
Yes, this is really important. And we do find that these small island states are absolutely taking the leadership, and they're working with our software, with open source software, with whatever they can get their hands on. And at Esri, we're doing a lot of work with the United Nations. And so that's where we are working with some of these small island states the closest. And my own work has been in American Samoa and Samoa. And even our work in Samoa is continuing because of our close partners in Conservation International. So I love the fact that the smallest are leading us as they should, and they know full well what's at stake, because they will just not have anything if we continue on this trajectory. I should also mention too that we are going into the United Nations Ocean Decade. It's the decade of ocean science for sustainable development. I really thank Alfredo for mentioning sustainable development, because there are going to be all kinds of efforts, again, led by many of these small island states to take action.
Nice, thank you. That's great to hear. I want to thank everyone for the presentations. They've all been fascinating and all build on each other and various ways. It's really been an impressive and amazing panel, and in many ways it could be a very interesting edited volume or a special journal issue as well, given much of the overlap. The next part of our discussion is I'll throw out some questions for the group, and I want the group to feel free to ask questions within or to each other as well. I don't want to just dominate the conversation. One question that I'll sort of lead with, and it sort of builds on Dawn's presentation, actually, since she had the scroll bar where we could see into the future. I would like you each to briefly comment on Geography 2050. What does your study site or your study topic, if you had to do this presentation in 2050, what would it look like? What are we talking about? What are the major issues? And I guess we could start in alphabetical order again with Steve.
Thanks, Mike. So I get the least time to think this large question through, but
sorry about that.
I mean, it's super interesting to think like that far ahead, and that's why this whole symposium is great, that it really does make you think that far forward. And I mean, some of the work that we've done together in Belize is showing how with eutrophication and actually from a natural system of birds, but that combination with sea level rise is pushing mangroves to the brink because of the way that eutrophication, excess of nutrients, is causing a differentiation in growth. So these mangroves are becoming top heavy. Hurricanes come through, storms come through, they topple over. And in the presentation, you actually saw one of the mangrove islands that had disappeared almost by 75% of its cover. And so the greatest threat at the moment, as I see it, is as a natural piece, or as natural as you can say, is sea level rise for mangroves. So what can we do where we build resilience at local levels so that we take away some of the anthropogenic threats at that local level? We help with restoration, we help build these ecosystems and the communities around them to be resilient. And then we really have to tackle sea level rise and the general drivers of that change, because that is what's going to hurt us the most, because we need sea level rise to not be accelerating at the rate it is. We know that it's part of a natural process, but we're pushing it. So how do we bring it down to allow these ecosystems to be able to adapt at a pace that is natural? And then we can get through it, and then we can build both resilient ecosystems and resilient communities in the coastal areas and further inland.
Awesome, thank you. That's great. Alfredo, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. This is a very interesting question. And I actually want to thank Dawn for mentioning the UN Decade of Ocean Sciences for Sustainable Development. I have been deeply involved in its inception, in pushing forward the implementation plan, and particularly in getting early career ocean professionals to become part of all of this. Our proposal has been, we have been doing these UN system initiatives in a certain way for decades now, and it's almost always the mid to late career people who do it and then expect the new generations to just like take them and run away with them. Let's get those voices to think strategically with them at the table, because in the end they are the ones that are going to be doing it, and they already have PhDs, masters. They know a little bit of what they are talking about, probably not the strategic vision just as developed yet. So if I was in 2050 and I had to look back and say like, okay, what did the decade achieve? One of the things that I will really pay attention to is how have we changed the paradigm of using technology and data to really map out what we are doing. And we heard about this a lot with things like the Internet of Things, for example, which means basically if you have a sensor measuring something and you detect a problem, you have the infrastructure and the capacity to address it real time. I would really like to see that all the problems that we talked about in this panel really move in that direction. We now have the technology. We are working on the policy frameworks. And we are having this new wave of early career professionals who think about these things a lot. So I would really like to see that.
Awesome. Thank you. Bernice?
So I think in order to answer that question, we have to stop just thinking about what's happening at the surface, and in our cities, think about what's happening in the subsurface, because the subsurface is really going to be the first indicator of the effects of sea level rise. And so in my presentation, I rushed through this figure a little bit quickly, but when we think about sea level rise, we think about it inundating the surface like a bathtub. In a dense urban environment, it's not going to be that simple. Water follows the path of least resistance. And so sea level is already starting to follow the path of least resilience through our subterranean infrastructure, like our storm sewers, and like in our basements, which are in many cases in dense cities, residences for people or host critical infrastructure. And those are going to be the parts of our cities that are actually going to flood first. So I'm really excited about the opportunity to start taking advantage of new data on the urban subsurface and to develop new approaches for representing the urban subsurface in our mapping and the impacts of sea level rise and climate change that are unfortunately already locked in and will affect our cities in 2050s on their subsurface infrastructure and residents and systems.
Nice. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. And then last but not least, certainly Dawn, you've mentioned quite a few 2040, 2050, 2060 already, but tell us where this is headed. What do you see?
Well, one thing that's going on right now is that we were able to make those maps right now showing us what might happen in 2040, 2050, 2060 because of the models that underlie them. And so there's going to be a continued effort to sharpen those models, to understand and to build in their uncertainty so that we have some indication of uncertainty in these maps. That's a long-standing problem in geography. How do you map and show the uncertainty in your observations, but certainly in your models? But following on from what my colleagues have said, in 2050, I think we're moving headlong towards a digital twin capability, and this gets to what Bernice was talking about with urban planning on the surface and the subsurface. So a digital twin this is going to be powerful for everything, but certainly for coastal areas because it's a virtual representation of an object or a process or a system, and it bridges that gap between the physical and the digital worlds. This gets to what Alfredo mentioned about the Internet of Things. There's certainly artificial intelligence that's going to be part of this, that's going to accelerate how we're able to innovate, how we're able to monitor and sense. But we need more acceleration in terms of building consensus. And I would like to see artificial intelligence be used not just for identifying things in imagery, which is certainly a big thing right now in geography, but also helping us to come to a quick decision so that we can save time and so that we can iteratively model these changes and test. So if there's a new subsurface sewer infrastructure, can we test how that system is going to function under a rapid and devastating flooding event, and how can we troubleshoot that? So here's hoping. We don't have people on the moon yet, but in 2050 we may have this. We don't have more people on the moon, but in 2050 we may have more digital twins.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I've asked all the questions so far. I'd like to open the floor a bit to see if there are some collaborative ideas or collaborative questions or anything else that the panel wants to discuss among the group or with each other.
So my question to my esteemed colleagues here who have given me a lot more to think about today. One of the things that I think is also key is partnerships as we move forward. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about this and the generational pieces, local knowledge, tech, business, ecologists, and I'd just be interested to learn a little bit more about some of the partnerships that you have developed with different people that might have surprised you to get you to sort of where you have been, where you are now?
Yeah, that's a hard one, because at Esri we do all kinds of partnerships, and we're partnering with the Smithsonian right now on a different project. We want to partner with Stanford's Center for Ocean Solutions, and we do a lot of partnerships with universities writ large. But in terms of what's surprising, I think what may be surprising is when partnerships among big players all come together all at once. And this again is why this UN decade is so, we have so much hope for that, because even with our indicators that we showed for Esri to come together with Microsoft and the National Geographic, that was not easy. It was not easy at all, even though we're all sort of in the same space. And what was easier was to connect with the United Nations, because the United Nations normally plays well with everyone. And then also with scholarly organizations like the American Geographical Society and the American Association of Geographers, and when all of those things come together into one product, that's pretty cool.
On my side, I recently started this new job as an Andre Hoffman Fellow, and one of the really cool parts of it is being part of the World Economic Forum. And that's exactly where you see this kind of partnerships that Don was talking about. It's just amazing to see how the job of the forum, the whole thing of the forum, is how do we take all of these players from industry, government, civil society, academia, and find those sometimes tiny common threads and build something out of that. And it's an art. And I am so excited to spend the next couple of years just learning that process. And I completely agree with you. This is all about partnerships. We have a lot of things going on, and now what we need to do is to work together.
Beatrice, did you want to jump in?
So one of the really surprising partnerships that I've started to develop is actually with historical societies and map librarians, particularly the historical societies in New York and Maryland. And so when you're thinking about doing climate change resilience research and flooding, you think about, for example, using the better or the best or the newest hydrodynamic models, or downscaling general circulation models for climate change in the newest way, which of course is really important. But then in interpreting those results and understanding why the landscape looks the way it does, or why a system works the way it does, or how we got in this situation, it's so valuable to actually work with historic maps and understand what the landscape looked like as the city was developing, and how that could have potentially driven the decisions that we made and what we can learn from those decisions. So I would have never thought that I'd be establishing these partnerships with historians and archivists, but they've been really important to my work.
Nice, thank you very much. Are there other, I have a question, but I don't want to take up any airspace. Are there other questions from the panel for your colleagues? Well, I can jump in.
Yeah, please do, because it's hard to beat Steve's question. That was such a good question. Stop that.
Well, it sort of builds on Steve's question a little bit. Steve and I have worked together in Belize, and we know lots of the same groups and folks, the fisher folks in Belize and Central America. And one of the frustrating things, I think, for us and for a lot of researchers and for local people is that the information, the technology doesn't always trickle down, and to borrow an economic term from the 1980s. And so if you could all talk just briefly again about what you're doing, and I know you're all working at different scales and on different topics, but how do we make sure the people that are most affected by storm sewer runoff or surges or technology of various states, or overfishing or mangrove deforestation, how are you in your research addressing that issue to make sure these people these communities have access to this information? And I realize I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot, because sometimes it's difficult in very rural areas that don't have access to the internet or technology, but perhaps you could even talk about if the information isn't available, what could be done to make it available?
I can start on that one. That has been a common topic since the beginning when I started doing research. I had the luxury of having a PhD advisor who, I don't know the percentage, but a very big percentage of his funding was to the community outreach and to really, really go back to the communities and say, like, this is the data we got from you. This is what it means for you. This is how you can use it to take decisions about your community, to talk to the government about your programs, to do something with it. And so that has become a really core value for me as a professional. Every time scientists, and we don't get paid to do this most of the times, every time scientists go to a community and need their data, need their information, any kind of interaction with them, there should be a responsibility to come back and tell them what happened with it. And this is just a cultural shift.
Exactly. Steve, do you want to?
So yeah, no, just second that it is, the onus is on us to give back the digested or analyzed pieces of information that we've either got from wherever or from them. And I think that that's the biggest thing as well, that we can't underestimate. It's not just us producing this information and then giving it to these people. These communities have a wealth of information. So like some of the fisheries work that I've done previously, and also mangrove knowledge, you can get 200 years worth of data just by sitting down and chatting with somebody for 20 minutes, because that's ingrained in them from getting it from their dad, from their grandfather, from their grandmother, and you can get generations of information. And I think this is the other key thing of the partnership. That is the partnership, that you're sharing conversations and data. You're getting this wealth of knowledge that perhaps, you know, satellites weren't up and around back then. So how do you get this data? How do you get some of these historic maps that in places that didn't have US geologists and geographers running around doing things? And I think that that's the key piece. And part of it is like with the Esri story maps as well. How do we make these conversations that it's not you going back and sort of expelling all of this information? It's that continuation of the conversation of, we found this and what do you make of that? And that it's this overall conversation that keeps that trust and transparency between the different partners and just keeps you moving forward in a way that, you know, gives you the feedback to make sure that you're not just making assumptions based on a misinterpretation of that data, and that they continue to feel that they lead the process, which they are leading, or very at least if it's a top-down approach, that they're included within this decision making. And I think inclusion of generations, diversities, indigenous peoples, all of that has to be a key part of this information sharing. And that's the key piece. It's information sharing, but it goes more than two ways. It's a round circle that keeps coming back.
Excellent. Yes, very true.
So I would also follow up on the importance of partnerships. I mean, we're doing better and better in terms of actually mapping flood hazard or mapping the changes in our ecosystems. But then your average person is not going to be, even if we're providing access to that map, your average person is not going to be aware that that map exists or is available to them without doing outreach, without letting them know. And then I also agree that it's really important to co-learn with the communities that you're working with, because you on your own might have some interpretation of the map's results, but they, given their lived experience in the community, can provide so much more insight for any set of results. So it's so valuable, even though, you know, we're really not incentivized to do this in many of the conventional ways, but it's so valuable to take the time to actually have a workshop and to talk to the stakeholders in your community and to actually share your results with them and learn from them, as well as, you know, share your interpretations of the results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Quick, that was what I was going to say as well. Given that we're running short on time, very quickly, we're at a large meeting, this Geography 2050 meeting or conference, but going down in scale and resolution, so to speak, to these smaller workshops with smaller groups within local communities, I think is one of the best ways. And in terms of technologies, the tech companies are working on mapping technologies where you just need a very simple cell phone network, or there's an appliance that you can use where you're using an intranet instead of the internet in places where it's very remote and it's hard to get to that kind of access. So those are the other types of innovations that I think we need.
Nice. Yeah, I know in my own research, if I can comment, I use Corridoko. It's a lat-long photo app that, in terms of ground truthing, if we've tested it's just as accurate or more accurate than a lot of the over-the-counter GPS units. So it's interesting to hear you say that. Okay, thank you all for those responses. Very interesting. How are we doing time-wise? Well, thank you all for the really interesting presentations. I know we would all rather be in New York in person, whereupon we might go out and have a libation at this point. But nonetheless, this has been really interesting and fascinating. And I think there are a lot of collaborative potential opportunities among this group. And I'm certainly, my brain is on overdrive right now. So again, I want to thank everybody for the fascinating presentations, and thank the AGS for giving us this opportunity to reach a larger audience. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. It was awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's been great, and good to meet all of you.